Hi, I'm Chris Baxter with Wilderness Redefined. Today I'm going to show you just how easy it is to set up your tent while camping. I've taken my tent out of its bag and I've split it into all of its components. Now, while every tent goes together slightly differently, they all have the same basic parts. And once you've put up one or two tents, it's pretty easy to figure out how to put up other tents. And one of the nice things is manufacturers over the years have learned that the easier their products are to use, the more happy people will be with the products. And so consequently, they build features into the tents to help instruct you on how to put them up. So the smallest bag here is going to be my pegs, right? So it's always good to have extra pegs and a variety of different peg types because the terrain that you're camping in may call for different pegs. So if you have really soft ground, you want a bigger peg. If you have hard ground, you want something that can take a bit of a beating with the hammer when you put the pegs into the ground. Then you have your poles. So your poles, in my case, these are aluminum poles, and I have basically a pole structure as well as a cross pole. And we'll see how those are used in a few minutes. Then we have our tent footprint. Now, not every tent comes with a footprint, but the footprint is basically designed to protect the bottom of your tent from the ground. The campground that we've chosen for this weekend is very gravelly, and the last thing you want is to have gravel poking holes in the bottom of your tent. Much cheaper to replace the footprint than it is to replace the tent body, so we use that footprint to give us that extra layer of protection. Now, one of the things I noticed about this particular footprint is it does have a red tab. So that tells me that there's going to be some sort of color coding to this tent when I set it up. And this is my tent body. This is the thing you sleep in. I noticed the same tab on here. So I'm going to make an educated guess here that these tabs will end up in the same place when I construct the tent. And finally, we have the tent fly. The purpose of the tent fly is to protect you from rain, basically. Keeps the tent itself dry. Because a lot of tents have a lot of mesh built into them, and so that is not waterproof. By having a nice taut fly over top of your tent, you will stay dry even if it's raining out. This is the area where I'm going to put my tent. It's nice and level. That's going to be a key consideration. It also looks like it's going to drain well. It's on gravel, but it does slope away from my tent over here. So if we get a lot of rain, I expect the water to go this way. But it does look like the area can use a little bit of a cleanup. Okay? I don't want to have anything poking into me while I'm sleeping, or worse, poking holes in my tent and my sleeping equipment. So I'm going to look around here. I see a couple of branches. They need to go. Pine cones, not so comfy to sleep on. I'm going to push those off to the side. I'm not going to worry too much about most of the gravel. I might kick out a little bit. Any big pokey sticks can go. Just kind of do a little cursory once over here, make sure that there's no big bumps that are going to make my sleep uncomfortable. We're going to poke holes in the tent. One last rock there. And maybe that one can go too. Sure, why not that one? Good. I think we're all good. So I'm going to grab my footprint. So as I mentioned earlier, my footprint has two red tabs. I know from experience that these two tabs line up on the front door of my tent. So this will be the long side, and these will be basically in the same location as my front door. So with this particular campsite, it's always nice to be able to walk into your campsite. So I'm going to put my door here and consequently put my footprint down so that these two red tabs are facing that direction. All right. I'm not going to worry about pegging this out because I'm going to move the whole tent around just to make sure it's perfectly level at the end, and then I'll do the pegging out. Okay. So now I'm going to grab my tent body. All right. So my tent body, again, we have two red tabs on this particular tent, which would align with these two sides of the tent. So I'm going to put my tent over the ground sheet, or footprint as we call it. I'm going to make sure that I'm not putting the meshy part of my tent in the dirt. Okay, no sense getting the tent dirty. Excellent. So this is generally the layout of my tent. Now it's time to construct the poles. Now it goes without saying that you should set your tent up at home before getting on your first camping trip. You want to make sure that you have all the parts, and you want to make sure you know how to use this, because while it's nice and warm and relatively sunny right now, there's no guarantee that it's going to be sunny when you arrive at camp. And the last thing you want to be doing is setting up your tent 2 or 3 times in the pouring rain because you didn't take time to learn how to put it together. So I'm going to take this pole bag, put it in my pocket, keep it out of the way, and these are my poles. Now I notice that I have 2 different poles here. I have a small set of poles. These are going to be my ridge pole. I'm going to go over top of the tent here. And the rest of the poles are all assembled together in one structure. This is becoming more and more common these days with tents, where manufacturers try to make it easy for you by putting everything together in one package. Now, the downside is this can become a tangled mess quite easily. These particular poles are made out of aluminum, and it's really important when you're putting them together that you don't let them snap. If they snap because they're shock corded, they can break. You can create little fissures or cracks in the edge of your poles, and then your pole will split. So instead, I'm going to be very gentle in assembling these poles. My tent is a simple 2-pole design where the poles are going to go from corner to corner and cross over each other in the middle. And there's going to be a second pole going over top to make the canopy. So what I'm going to do to start is I'm going to kind of configure the poles the way they need to go in the tent. In that X shape. And now, when it comes time to start putting the poles into the tent, you need to find the anchor point for your poles. So my poles have a little knob here that goes into this particular hole. If your tent has multiple holes, start off with the hole that's furthest away from the tent so that you're not putting undue stress on your tent. Mine only has the one hole, so here we go. Now this can be challenging if you're doing it by yourself, but I tend to put the 2 poles across from each other in, the 2 corners that are across from each other in. So I'm starting here. I'm going to come around to the back one. And keeping that under tension, putting in the second hole. And then while I'm here, I'll put this corner in. Of course, if you have a buddy to help, you can always get them to help you. And I'm coming around to the last corner. Okay. All right. Now the shape of this looks a little funny, so I need to move the little plastic anchor so that it's kind of centered on the tent. Good. And now this is what's known as a clip-in tent, where there's little clips. So I'm going to start on one side, clip the tent into place. And make any last adjustments to the positioning. So this little part sits right over the middle, and this gets clipped on here. So that's my tent. Now the part that comes in next is the cross pole. And again, not every tent model will have one of these, but mine does. And it connects here, and it goes to the other side. There you have it. So we've done a pretty good job keeping the tent over top of the footprint, but we want the footprint to move with the tent. So I'm going to go around and put the footprint underneath. There's like another attachment, so that's going to go onto the same pole. And I'm going to go around the tent and do the remaining 3. Now it's time to pay out my tent. These provincial campgrounds in British Columbia are notorious for having really hard-packed tent pads. So sometimes there's a bit of luck involved in getting your pegs in the ground. These are pretty solid pegs that came with the tent. I'm going to start with one corner and then work my way around. So I'm going to go through both loops here. They're adjustable, which is nice. And so I can move the loop away from the tent if the first place I try to bang the peg in doesn't work. When you're pegging a tent peg in, you want to go sort of on a 45-degree angle away from the tent. So if I peg it like this or like this, it's more easy to pull it out of the ground. So you want to angle it away. And then I'm going to use this mallet. And of course, I've hit a rock. So I can readjust, pick a slightly different spot. All right. When pegging out subsequent corners, you want to make sure that you're pulling the tent away from the corners that have already been pegged in so that your floor is really, really taut. So I'm going to pull this out sort of at a 45-degree angle. And again, I'm going to try to get this peg. That's not working. Pick a slightly different spot. Ground's very hard. I seem to have found a spot that really doesn't like my first peg, so I'm going to try a different style of peg. A little bit of a V-groove in it. Tends to cut through things a little bit easier. Of course, if you hit a big rock, there's nothing you can do, but we'll give this a whirl and see what happens. All right, that one's in the ground. And I can go ahead and tighten up my tent against it. Perfect. Now, when I go around to the other corners of the tent, I want to make sure I pull the tent so that I get tension and keep my tent really taut along the floor line. Okay? Having a very taut tent is really important when you're setting it up. All right, now it's time to put the fly on our tent. Again, the fly is there to provide some rain and wind protection. I'm going to look for the little red tabs and match those up with the red tabs on my tent. Okay, so I know that my particular tent has a ventilation port here on the side, and if I put the fly on backwards, those ports aren't going to line up. So very important that you put your fly on correctly by matching the red tabs, in this case to here. Other tent manufacturers will use different systems, but it's usually pretty easy to figure out which way the fly goes on. So I got one red corner there. I'm going to look for the other one. There it is. So these two red corners need to end up over here. So I'm going to make sure that happens. One red corner there. All right, so double checking, red tab to red tab, red tab to red tab. Perfect. So most flies will have a form of attaching themselves to the tent body. So if you look here on the underside, there's a little Velcro loop. Okay, there's another one here. So these are going to go onto the tent pole, and the reason for these is that they help align the seams of the fly with the poles of the tent. That's the way the manufacturer designed the tent to be. So the tent is most waterproof and properly erected when the seam of the fly goes over the pole in the tent. So before clipping my fly in, I'm going to go around and do all of the Velcros. Next step in putting on the fly is I'm going to attach the fly corner to the attachment points here on my tent. So mine happen to use these quick buckles, and there's two of them, one closer to the tent, one furthest away. I'm going to loosen these off at the start. I can always tension them later on. Okay. Corner one. corner 2, corner 3, and corner 4. Most tents will have what's known as a vestibule. This is an area where you can store your gear or your boots um, while being protected from the rain. They'll be outside of the main living compartment. And so in my case, my vestibule has a single strap for pegging it out. So I'm going to try to peg it somewhere in this area here, see what we can find. All right. I'm going to go around and do the one on the back side as well. So many tents have extra attachment points. Okay, I've coiled this up to keep it out of the way. These are really only useful if you're expecting a lot of wind, if you're going to be in place for a long time. I rarely use these 4 corner ones, but I will use the ones on the side and pull the tent fly away from the tent body to promote good drainage. So what do you do if you get to one of your tent pegs and you just can't get it into the ground? Ground's too hard, you hit a rock, you're frustrated, whatever. I'm going to show you a different way to put it to peg out your tent. So here's the very last attachment point for my tent. It's here on the fly. I'm going to pull the fly away from the tent body, and I'm going to use a log. You can also use a rock or anything else that's heavy, but let's take this log, roll it out of the way, roll it back over the rope. And this log is going to be heavy enough to be my anchor. And if I don't want it to roll towards the tent, I can kind of put a rock here. That'll prevent it from rolling towards the tent. So the way I'm going to attach this is through a knot called a trucker's hitch. So for a trucker's hitch, I make a twist. I poke the rope through to make a loop, and this becomes like a pulley. And I can then take the tail end of the rope through the pulley and tighten it until I'm happy, and then I secure it with a little half hitch. Okay. So now our tent is fully set up. We can go around and just tighten up some of the attachment points, see if there's anything that's loose, snug them up a little bit. Okay. Now some of the older tents with nylon flies, or cheaper tents with nylon flies, that fly material will stretch over the course of the day. And with some of the newer tents, that's not the case. So it's always a good idea, though, to check and make sure your fly is nice and snug on the tent. Go around all the way, because you want this to be kind of drum tight. The tighter the fly is, the better it'll shed rain. Okay. I always get in the habit, too, of checking this before I go to bed. And then finally, people will trip over your tent, no matter what you do. So I'm going to go around, look for things like a rock. I'm going to find a rock over here. You can't see me, but I'm going to find a rock. And I'm going to put it, in front of tent pegs to avoid people tripping over my tent and ripping the pegs out of the ground and make my shelter less secure. I'm going to go do that around the whole perimeter if I'm going to be camping for a while, just to add that safety, make it easier to see my tent pegs in the ground. Once your tent's set up, you can open up your vestibule. Then it's time to move in.